This morning's edition is about the shin plaster of the Empire State, the billionaires' row of New England. The shin plaster of Empire State, also known as Mill Pond, Lake George. Now, when we talk about the Mill Pond, Lake George, you need to understand the whole story. In New York, New England, where the king owns all the trees in the empire, the trees are big bucks. You've got the forestry industry, and you got the paper making industry, and all the industries that support the mills. Now, the land where the forests have been declared, this is where the mining and the lumbering and the pulpwood harvesting goes on. Now, let's focus on the Mill Pond, Lake George. You've got International Paper Corporation, Lake George Paper Company, Ticonderoga Paper Company, the Glens Falls Paper Company, and lots of other ones. Over at Curtis Falls. Hey there, Mr. J. Curtis. At Curtis Falls. And you got Curtis Lumber. And you've got all these industries that convert huge amounts of forest land products into enormous amounts of the empire's shin plaster. Lake George, the water in this 242 square mile lake basin, is drained through a pinhole. You can't make this stuff up, folks. The lake basin, 242 square miles, is drained through a pinhole. Just like one of those sand clocks, you know, those sand is diverted down through the pinhole, and takes a long time for that sand to drain into the lower vessel. Alright. When you understand the pinhole of Lake George, you understand that that pinhole is directing the water so that the mining and timbering industries can convert it to energy, so that they can process their pulpwood, so they can saw their logs, so they can grind their grains. The mills of Ticonderoga along the Lachute River. Now today there's an upper power plant that produces 4.2 megawatts, and then there's a lower Lachute power generator that produces 3.8 megawatts. So you've got approximately 8 megawatts of electrical production. That's 8 million kilovolts of production along the Lachute River at about 11 cents a megawatt. So you've got annual power production somewhere in the vicinity of $9 to $10 million every year. And that power production is used primarily to power the international paper corporations' mill operations, converting the empire's forests into money. Now, this entire harnessing of the horsepower on the mill pond through the pinhole is an extremely profitable endeavor for the handful of people that control it, which would primarily be the Glens Falls banks. Glens Falls National Bank and the Glens Falls First National Bank. And you've got huge amounts of investors involved in the paper mills, International Paper, for one, and the Glens Falls Paper and the Ticonderoga Paper, the Lake George Paper Company, and so on and so forth. You even had the Delano Paper and Mill Company. Delano, Franklin Delano Roosevelt there. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The money. It's all about the money, or what's also known as the shin plaster. The empire's shin plaster. This is why it's so important that they have the up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down water cycling on the mill pond, Lake George. It means a lot of money to the clique that runs Warren County, Washington County, and Essex County. And they process all the trees out of the state forests from the empire. Now we're going to shift gears here just a little bit. We're going to discuss about the state forest for a second. In 1891 or 1892, they had to protect the water. They had to protect the water quality of the Hudson River. So they created this state forest preserve, which was 550,000 acres, give or take. Approximately 550,000 acres, when the constitutional amendment to protect as forever wild the state forest preserve, it was less than 600,000 acres. Today, it's exploded. Now it's over 6 million acres. It's the park that never stops growing. This Adirondack Park, the ka-ching, 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 the money pot, honey pot of the Empire State has exploded to over 6 million acres. And growing, by the way. They want to grow it just as big as they can possibly grow it. And then, obviously, they've got the Catskill Park there north of New York City, down in the Catskills. And then, you know, we've got environmental confiscation. The Department of Environmental Confiscation imposing sustainability and forever wild and confiscation policies all over the empire. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, all over the United States. This Agenda 21 crowd, like termites, is incrementally eating away at the freedom and liberty of the American people to own land and to use their property for anything from agricultural purposes to development, to marketing. They don't want people to have control over the empire's shin plaster producing honeypot money pots. Now, for the benefit of my oldest sister, she has become intrigued and witness to the rape of my mother and father at Lake George, New York, caused directly by the up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down water cycling on the mill pond. Lake George. They do this in the wintertime. They call it wintertime drawdown. They got to draw the lake down in the wintertime because the pinhole that they engineered and intentionally and purposely built, installed and constructed at the top of the upper falls at Weedville, at the exit of Lake George, pardon me. They engineered and built and purposely financed and installed the pinhole to operate like an hourglass, letting the sand drop down through that little tiny pinhole so that it takes longer. And they direct all of the water via the pinhole into their electrical turbines. The pinhole was purposely, specifically constructed to harness the lake, to pond back the water, and to divert it into their bank accounts. This entire pinhole operation and the wintertime drawdown is nothing more than their way of allowing the water to run just as long as possible to make them just as much money as possible, shin plaster for their bank accounts, using the mill pond at Lake George. Just like an hourglass is manufactured, engineered, and made to harness the power of the sand to measure time. The pinhole installed on Lake George is to power the oligarchs, power the 1% of the bankster gangsters that run Warren, Washington, and Essex County in the Empire's state. This is why they protect it. This is why we have to have the pinhole, because it means a lot of money to certain people. Certain people create a lot of wealth from directing the horsepower, the water of Lake George, through their pinhole to their electrical generators and their mills. There are not so many mills anymore, but that's because they were dumping huge amounts of toxins and poisons into Lake Champlain. And then, of course, they'd use the Lake George waters to flush all of these toxins and poisons and slop out into the front of Fort Ticonderoga on the bottom of Lake Champlain. And this is all historical record. The government records of what I just said are copious. There are enormous amounts of proof and evidence to show the flushing of the giant toilet at Lake George, which dilutes the pollution of the emerald green waters of the leachate-filled Lake George, New York. This is how they flush Lake George so that it doesn't turn sea foam green, full of sewage and septic tank cesspool drainings, which are leaching into the lake in the bedrock stone lake basin. I know this is seemingly getting a little complicated, but it's not. It's like a big toilet. They flush the toilet to get rid of all the pollution and the leachate out of Lake George. And then when they're flushing the toilet, dilution is the solution to pollution. Environmental conservation knows damn well. Environmental confiscation knows damn well that dilution is the solution to pollution. And when they flush the lake, it goes through the pinhole, and the Glens Falls gangster banksters and the mill operators and the insurance companies and the lawyers and the politicians, well, they all stuff their pockets with billions. This has been going on for many decades. And the witnesses and the evidence that I've amassed is enormous. They can't hide it anymore. They just can't hide it anymore. Now, folks, I'm going to leave it right there. We've taken a deep, close, hard look into how the shin plasters of the empire. And you need to look up what shin plasters are, and then you'll understand what the Empire State is a party to. The Empire and its shin plasters, which just by coincidentally are made out of wood fiber and wood pulp. Paper pulp, you know, the paper shin plasters of the Empire. Isn't this interesting? Before we're through exposing this little gang of shin plaster mobsters, you're going to get a bigger picture of the significance of Mill Pond, Lake George. Hasta la vista, ladies and gentlemen. God bless, and you betcha, we're definitely coming back.